Now, I've been doing no-code development for a couple of years, and regardless what kind of tool I'm using and what kind of app I'm building, I'm always confronting the same challenges. And so there's a very good chance if you're building a serious production app, you're going to be facing the same challenges that I've been facing when I'm building my apps. And so in today's video, I want to share with you 5 critical no-code concepts that you must master in order to build a successful app. These are evergreen concepts that are going to apply to you regardless what kind of no-code tool you're using or what kind of app you are building. Now, before we get started, I just want to remind you that all the apps that I'm going to be building and are showing you in today's video are going to be available to view and or clone on my Patreon page, and you're going to see a link to it in the description below. Now, the first very important concept that you must master is storage. Now, we're not just talking about what kind of storage backend to use, whether you're going to be using Firebase, Supabase, or Xano, or maybe something else. This is something that I discussed in one of the previous videos. What I'm referring to is how you're actually going to be arranging the data in your tool of choice. So maybe you're going to be using Firebase and you're going to be using Cloud Firestore. Well, how are you going to be arranging that data? Because the thing about Firestore, it's a NoSQL database. And so there's so many ways of arranging that data. You can have a collection, you can have a bunch of sub collections, you can have even list of items, you can have arrays inside of a collection. And that's mainly going to depend on the kind of app you're going to be building. So if you're building something like a social media client, like a Twitter clone, you're going to arrange the data in a certain way. If you're building something like a Tinder clone, you're going to arrange your data in a certain way. If you're building maybe like an e-commerce app, you're going to be arranging your data in a completely different way. And this is very, very important. You have to get to a point where you can immediately look at the app that you're building and you can say to yourself, okay, this is how I envision my app to look. And this is how I envision the data to be structured. Because the thing you have to understand about no code is that it's a lot less forgiving in how it takes the data that you're storing and displays it to the end user. You're kind of limited in ways that you can manipulate that data. So your best chance is to store the data exactly how you want to display it. And that is why it's super, super important to internalize what kind of app you're building and right away understand the cons and pros of the different strategies, whether you're going to have one big collection and lots of documents, or you're going to break it apart into, a bunch of collections with documents and other sub collections inside of it. That is very, very important when you're working with no code tools. And so it's not only about deciding whether you're going to be storing your data in a NoSQL database or a relational database, but it's more about understanding it, how you're actually going to be arranging that data. Many collections, single collections, lots of fields, break those fields up into different collections, etc., etc. This is something that you have to master early on because it's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of headaches, regardless what kind of app you're building. Now, the next critical concept that you have to master is something having to do with authorizations and multi-tenancy. Now, authorizations is very different from authentication. Authentication is simply allowing a user, any user who has the right login and password, to access a page or to access a resource. Authorization is more about checking whether a specific authenticated user has access to a specific resource. So here I have a page that describes something called a multi-tenant application and a multi-tenant architecture. And that is going to be a situation where you might have a lot of users, and these users need to have access to different pieces of data. So here we have user A, user B and C, a lot of users, and they might have access to different pieces of your main database. And so if you're building any kind of app that's going to be used by multiple users, or maybe it's going to be used by multiple groups, made up of users, and each of those groups might be using different roles. So an example might be something like maybe employees, and then an employer can be in a separate role. They're going to need access to different resources, whereas employees are still authenticated users and they're going to need access to different resources as well. This is actually a very standard and a very common practice when you're building apps that are going to be used by multiple users of varying access levels. And so if you're using something like Firestore DB, you might have a situation where you have all users accessing that one collection, and then you can have multiple users having access to their own sub collection. Or you may have a top level collection that can be accessed by one company. So company A has access to this one top level collection and all the other sub collections. And then another company might have access to another top level collection and all the sub collections undering. And all of these are different strategies of allowing different users, maybe with different roles, different access rights, to access different pieces of data and manipulate that data in ways that their specific roles allow them to do. I guarantee you that if you're building an app that's going to require authentication, you're definitely going to be facing an issue where you will need to segregate the way different resources, maybe things like different pages, different widgets, different functionalities are accessed by different users and different groups. Now, the next important concept that you have to master is you always want to be thinking about building reactive apps. You never want to be thinking about building apps that require constant user interaction, constant navigation in order to get the data and the response that the users need. Maybe 5 years ago, you can get away with building an app that acts like a web page where a user can enter some input, click submit, and then go to the next page. But nowadays, users want their apps to be reactive. They want their apps to do exactly what they told them to do right now without navigating to another page, without waiting for it to do something. They want it to work right now. Now, fortunately, a lot of frameworks that are being released now, as well as being released in the last couple of years, are built from the ground up to be reactive. Flutter is a very, very reactive framework. There's lots of other very, very reactive frameworks. The problem is that when you're using no-code tools that are built on top of these reactive frameworks, such as FlutterFlow, which is built on top of Flutter, you might not have that same reactive ability as compared to if you were building your app directly in Flutter. And that is why you have to pay extra attention and make sure that you're leveraging all the features in the tool that you're building to make your app reactive. So let me show you an example. So for instance, here I have an app that uses a bunch of widgets. And if you run this app, you can see that, for instance, I have this autocomplete here. And if I type something, I immediately see response. I need to make sure that it's pulling data instantly. Very, very important. Another really quick example here is that if you go over here, if I drag this way, this is going to change. I need to make sure that this is connected, and that way it's going to automatically change. Because if I don't connect this to here, it's not going to change. Same thing here. If I click this button, I need this to start the countdown. If I do that, it stops the countdown. Another really, really simple example is if I have something like an empty page and I have here a local state, well, what I can do is I can create an action where, let's say, we have a button here as well. I had a button here. And when I click on this button, I want to change the local state and I want it to be reflected on this page. So what I need to do is I need to link this variable to a local state here, let's say a task time, but there's something else that I need to do. I need to create an action. And what I need to do is I need to do update local state. And when I do update local state, I need to specify this update type. I need to make sure that I set it to rebuild all pages, rebuild current page, or no rebuild. Because if I don't do that, then it's not going to be reactive. Then it's just going to update the data, but this is not going to be updated automatically. It's not going to automatically show up the data. And so when you think about building apps, don't think about, showing that new data if the user navigates to another page or the user explicitly asks for the data, for the new data to be shown. You want to do it automatically. You want the app to kind of update itself depending on the state. That's what reactive means. And that's what users expect. And that is something you always want to be keeping in mind. And especially when you're using no code tools, you want to make sure that you're leveraging that extra functionality here. You're looking at these settings here, you're updating it, and you're telling your no code tool that you want that data to be updated immediately, not tomorrow. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is integrations. You have to understand that with no code tools, you're kind of limited in terms of functionality and the features. And so what I mean by that is, let's say you're using a tool such as FlutterFlow, which is an amazing, amazing tool, one of the best tools out there. You can do a ton of things, but there are also a ton of things that you can do. For instance, let's say I want to send an email after, a person presses this button here. I can't do that in FlutterFlow. Let's say I want to do something else. I want to, use some other service, connect to, Google Sheets or something like that. It's going to be a little clunky to do it. And in many cases, this is relatively easier to do if you're building an app from scratch because you have access to libraries and things like that. Well, fortunately, it's also very, very easy to do with no code if you are using integration. So for instance, you can use a tool such as Zapier and you can connect all your apps together. So you can save new Gmail attachments automatically to Google Drive. You can, do some kind of request if some kind of action happens inside of your apps. You can easily send an email. You don't have to worry about all that. All of these problems are basically solved with these third-party integration. And so things like sending an email, connecting to Airtable are easily accomplished using these integration apps. But there's also something that's a lot more important than merely sending an email or connecting to a third-party service. And that is a very, very common situation that a lot of no-code developers face anytime they want to go the extra mile. They want to maybe manipulate the data a little bit more. They want to do some extra things. And so a really good example here is, let's say you have an app, we have user, UI pages, we have logic, and we have a database. Well, the only things that you can do to a database are the things that the user is doing in your no-code app. So for instance, if you have, maybe an input element here and the user presses the button, well, you can save that input. But what if you want to do something more to the database? For instance, in FlutterFlow, you cannot update the same collection in the same action. So for instance, if I have an input name here or input field and I need to save it, well, I saved it in that collection, but I can't do anything else to that exact collection in the same action. And that is where real-time integrations come in. And now I have a lot of interesting and innovative ideas that all of you are gonna love, having to do with real-time integrations. And those are topics for future videos. So definitely stay tuned for that. You're going to get a ton of value out of it. Now, since we're on the topic of integrations, let's quickly talk about APIs, which is the bare bone way of connecting to all of these different services. Now, creating these APIs and connecting to a lot of these third-party services, whether you are getting new data or posting new data, is definitely a lot of fun because you're able to get access to data that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. And same for services. You're able to get access to services that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get. And all of that is definitely awesome. But what is not awesome is being overcharged for APIs because you had to send multiple requests to get new data into your app. That is because most of the APIs that you're going to be using, you will have to pay a little bit here and there, which is fine if you're making, a couple of requests here or a couple of requests there. But if you have a production app, you have a lot of users and you need to constantly make requests, those cents here and there are going to quickly add up. And so the solution to all of that is you need to do the right caching. You need to be able to cache your data. And this is going to be an absolute requirement for any kind of a serious app. You just won't be able to scale if you constantly need to make requests in order to get new data. You must be able to cache. Now, the way you're going to be caching your data obviously depends on your specific app. There are all kinds of different ways of caching data, from very, very simple ways to more complex, more involved ways. For instance, here we have a Flutter Cache manager with 1,000+ likes, 99% popularity. And here we have a Flutter Cache store, another little plugin that you can use in order to help with your caching. And so regardless what kind of app you're building, if you're going to be accessing third-party data and you're looking to build a production app that's going to scale into thousands, hundreds of thousands, or maybe even millions of users, you need to think about caching, and you need to think about it up front as you're building the app, not later on. Now, for this last one, I want to give you a bonus tip that's definitely going to help you this year and beyond. And this is also something where I've been spending a lot of my free time in, because it's a very, very exciting area right now. So there are lots of interesting AI tools being developed and being released. It seems like every day there's a new AI tool that's popping up on the market. And this could be a brand new tool completely, or this could be a tool that's working slightly different than another tool that it's based on. Now, the key point here is that the more established AI tools have APIs that you can access from within just about any app. So you can use a tool such as FlutterFlow to access their services via an API and integrate them into your app. But that is not the case for all the tools out there. Some of the newer tools don't have an API interface yet, and you can only access them if you're building an app from scratch. You can import the module and use it inside of your app, or you can access them from a command line. But if you're using a no-code tool such as FlutterFlow or anything else, you really can't access them without an API. And this is where you come in, because you can essentially take many of these tools, package them in some way that exposes an API that your no-code tools can use. Here I am on OpenAI.com. OpenAI has an API. ChatGPT does not yet have an API. Here I am at stability.ai, which is an amazing tool for building images, drawing images from a prompt. They also have an API. On the other hand, you also have a really new and exciting tool called Image to Image. And the way this tool works is that it's able to take an image that you perhaps drew yourself or somebody drew by hand, and it can create a realistic image. And this is a relatively new tool, and so there's no standard API for it. Another really good example is Whisper.ai, and it's also from OpenAI, and this is a state-of-the-art speech recognition engine. In fact, it's one of the best speech recognition tools available on the market right now, and it's absolutely free. You can download the code and you can run it on your own machine. But the problem is that there's really no standard API for this tool. Well, thankfully, there are also other tools that allow you to take these brand new AI tools and wrap them with an API shell around them. So an example could be something like modal.com that allows you to take this tool and put an API around it. But another really popular tool is replicate.com. And this is another tool that allows you to take one of these tools, and instead of running it on your own machine for your own use, you can upload it to the cloud and you can wrap an API around it, which is going to enable you to use it from your no-code tool of choice, such as FlutterFlow. Another plus of this is that it's also going to give you a first mover advantage, because you'll be able to build no-code apps leveraging these new emergent AI tools, which is amazing, which is awesome. You can be sure that there's not a lot of no-code developers that are doing this right now. And so this is a very, very hot area that you want to keep your eye on, because there's lots and lots of interesting AI tools popping up left and right. And they're not all going to have APIs right away. That's going to come later eventually. But using the techniques I talked about, you'll be able to leverage them very, very quickly. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video, you found it valuable, and you also found it relevant to your own apps that you're building, to your own challenges, to some of the apps you're thinking about building, then you definitely want to check out my Patreon page. On my Patreon page, not only will you get access to all the apps that I built with FlutterFlow, as well as some of the other no-code builders, you can simply pick an app, you can view it, you can also clone it and get a head start and start building that app. And that way you can easily change things around and get a head start without building an app from scratch. But you'll also get access to a lot of other content such as Q&As, live streams, behind the scenes content, my masterclass episodes, where we do a deep dive in various topics that the community finds challenging, where the community has a lot of issues understanding. We actually just recently had a masterclass, and I can see doing a Q&A very, very soon as well. Plus, when you join my Patreon community, you're going to be supporting this channel and supporting my work, which is greatly appreciated. So if you're not yet a member, check out the link in the description, have a look, and definitely think about subscribing. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video and you're looking for more tips and tricks when it comes to no code or FlutterFlow, check out this video in the corner next.